Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, when it comes to the exploration side of Shadow of the Erdtree, things are somehow both much simpler and also much more complex than they were in the base game. The actual density of things per space traveled seems to be much lower, but it is also easier than ever to miss full-on portions of the map just because of how deeply intertwined every little nook and cranny can be, especially vertically speaking, with entire regions being locked behind a single out-of-the-way cave or an illusion wall in an already relatively hidden area. And through almost all of these things are, well, bosses. Sometimes mini-bosses, which are, boss-equivalent enemies generally that also have either somewhat unique fights, dramatic fights, or just somewhat unique actual drops at the end of them, just with a lack of boss health bar itself. So today we're going to go over a number of optional, missable bosses and mini-boss fights in Shadow of the Erdtree so you can make sure that they're all ticked off of your own personal checklist. That said, I'll go through the list in a sort of game progression order. The later in the video it is, the more difficult it will be to access from the first grace of the DLC. For each entry, I will first show you where the boss is, then give you an opportunity to find it yourself before showing what the boss actually is on screen. Without further ado then, first up today is located inside of the Dragon's Pit Cave in the Gravesite Plains area. This is a relatively well-known cave with a relatively well-known boss at this stage, given that defeating the main boss of the area gives you access to a whole other region of the map, if not technically two, but for those who approach the cave already having this knowledge, you may have missed out on a more interesting part of it if you just went through the direct path. Once you are inside the cave, if you simply progress along the main path of it until you reach this sort of altar being prayed to with a hole beside it, you can then jump through the hole and then you land on a staircase. Down the stairs is the normal progression, the way to get to the actual boss, but up the stairs is a returning mini-boss enemy type from the base game. So look away now if you don't want to see it, but this one up here is going to be a magma worm. Relatively standard moveset for one of these, so the room is a bit awkwardly cramped for it for sure, but it is nice to see the return of a pretty classic enemy archetype in the game to let us just sort of mess with it with our new equipment and our new toys. The actual drops from this one then when you kill it are a dragon heart for spending on dragon communion incantations, as well as an ancient dragon smithing stone for upgrading any non-somber weapons through the final level, as well as some other random goodies that are just on the floor in the actual room of the fight. Another fun fact here though is while the cave clearly has a hole in the top of the room that looks almost designed to just make people accidentally fall in from the overworld directly onto a magma worm, if you were to go to the exact spot that this is above the room on the map, there is no actual hole to fall into, just a nice fun little visual flair. Second up today then is located down in the lower section of the Gravesite Plains, specifically from the river under the Great Bridge. This is the normal path to get to the Cerulean Coast, the southern region, but from the Elec River Cave site of Grace, the normal direction would be to go south. If instead though you go north along the river, then right underneath the bridge itself, you will come across our next mini-boss encounter. Skip to the time on screen if you want to just move on to the next section, otherwise this one is going to be an ulcerated tree spirit enemy from the base game, essentially defending the bridge like a strange woody troll underneath it. On defeat, this one gives you a brand new reusable tool, the Horned Bairn. This is essentially a DLC version of the Omen Bairn items from the base game, with the main difference being that this one works a bit more like the various phalanx sorceries, where it summons multiple bairns above your head that will then stay there unless there is an enemy within range of you, at which point they will home in and track on them if you're targeting them as strong projectiles. The FP cost is relatively low compared to the damage this actually does, and unless you're doing a funky consumable build though with this, it won't be a particularly overly useful thing for you, but it is definitely an interesting bit of lore on this item, and it's an extra tool for your belt. Third then today is actually quite close to our last one. You could even say that number 2 was on the way to it, as the location of the next one is in the Rivermouth Cave, which is also just north upriver from the Elec River Cave site of Grace. That said, once you actually reach the cave, it is all the way at the end of the path, and once inside of it, I'll just let the full thing play out to actually reach the boss, so skip to the time on screen if you don't want to see actually what is in here for yourself. That said, now that you're here, the boss inside of this fog wall is going to be Chief Bloodfiend. You guessed it, Chief of the Bloodfiend enemies that were outside and are all around the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion. This guy wields their big club weapon, he has a more diverse moveset than any of his non-boss companions, and is just generally much more challenging. The reward that you get for killing him at the end of the fight then is the Bloodfiend Hexer Spirit Ashes. This summons one of these spear-wielding Bloodfiends to help you out in combat, and he acts basically like a mini Moog. He does the little heal that the Bloodfiends do, and in general is just all about trying to proc bleed on your enemies as much as possible. So if you're in a build that benefits from something like that, if you're in a bleed build and you're using summons, this guy may just become one of your new closest friends. Moving on to our fourth entry then, this is an interesting one because you either definitely found it or more than likely missed it, and it entirely depends on your order of progression. If you entered the Shadow Altus region through the main gate, which comes from Castle Ensis and the Remembrance boss that is blocking it, you may well have missed this area entirely, but the location itself is at least a required path for the skip of Castle Ensis, which is the Fort of Reprimand in the southeast of Shadow Altus. Once you are in the fort itself then, the boss room itself is quite easy to find, honestly, just in the back corner of a tiny room with an obvious archway leading to it, so you will know when you are there, so you want to skip to the next entry if you want to preserve it. Otherwise, inside of here is going to be Black Knight Idrid. You may start to notice something about the Black Knight enemies in this expansion, especially the boss versions, if you saw our last optional boss video as well, and it's that they seem to be inherently tied to the Crucible Knights and Crucible incantations. This is immediately obvious upon killing him too, as what he drops is Ash of War, aspect of the Crucible, Wings. This is one of the cooler Ashes of War in the entire expansion. You grow out wings just like Crucible enemies do, and then do a forward lunging charge. This gets even funkier and stronger though if you do it with Twin Blades equipped specifically, as they have a unique animation with this Ash of War where you spin the weapon along as you charge, getting in a ton of bonus multi-hits and thus just adding a lot of synergy potential with the combo. That said, behind this boss there is also a staircase that leads up to a ladder, which then leads up to another ladder, which then leads up to a chest, and inside of that chest is a cookbook that lets you craft a new item called Festive Grease. This quite simply just gives you runes on hit while active, so that's a nice little extra bonus too. Fifth today then is going to be up in the northwest side of the map, specifically in the lower section of the ruins, accessed from the Shadow Altus area relatively early on if you know where you're going. That said, this is the simple path there from the ancient ruins base, Site of Grace, down in the valley. The map is pretty much accurate, there's no hidden inside paths, there's no weird places to get through, and aside from some annoying enemies along the way, this is just a nice chill horse ride right up to the spot that I've marked. That said, because of this, you will want to turn away now if you don't want to see the boss that's actually here in the video. Otherwise, this one is Rugalia, the Great Red Bear. There are only a couple of these named Great Red Bear bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree, but they are personally one of my favorite fights as someone who just really likes bears, especially big ones. The enemy can be brutal, but the biggest tip I can give you is that most of its generic swiping and claw attacks can be completely avoided by just being too close to it, and most of its ground effects can be avoided by jumping. So you want to either just hug under its arms basically, or be constantly jumping. As for the reward you get from defeating this one then, it is Rugalia's Roar. This is the only one of a whole new school of incantations that was added technically, which is the Bear Communion incantations. There's even armor that exists to boost specifically this only spell because it's the only Bear Communion incantation. But sadly, as the only Bear Communion spell, even boosted to its maximum, the damage of it is pretty sad, but it does make you do a cool Bear Roar, and while the Dragon Communion stuff is arguably more cool to the average person, this Bear Roar is more just fun to have, really. Sixth up then we have another more mini-boss type enemy, but it's one that I bet nearly everyone will appreciate finding if they have not seen it yet. And this is located in the Charo's Hidden Grave region, right above the Cerulean coast. You access this from the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion, which you get to from the Dragon's Pit Terminus, Site of Grace. Along the default path then, from the entrance of the Charo's Hidden Grave area up to the first Site of Grace, you are pretty much guaranteed to run into this mini-boss, but that's only if you come here to begin with. That said, look away now to avoid spoilers, otherwise the mini-boss here is the return of Tibia Mariner, everyone's favorite just silly little ghostly boatman who's just living his best life while we kill him just 1,000 times in 1,000 different locations. This one then, upon first walking up to him, will try and teleport away. He does this a couple more times, but it's always still in view where he actually goes. By the time though he actually starts the fight, unless you kill him really quickly, you'll start spawning some pretty vicious undead like a full-on Revenant enemy from the base game, which is definitely not the most fun to deal with, but otherwise is a pretty standard fun little Mariner encounter. The reward that you get for completing it then is the Tibia Cookbook, which lets you craft the Call of Tibia consumable item, and what this does then when you use it very simply is you throw it at something, this spawns a ghostly undead right beside them who will then attack them 3 times by spinning and then disappear. More just another neat little consumable item than anything else, but another nice little find for sure. 7th then is something that most people will probably have seen, but not necessarily everyone has killed, and it is a mini-boss located about a 20-foot distance away from the ancient Rawa Ruins East Site of Grace right here, right at the end of the bridge. Look away then if you don't want to see it, but this is just the Crucible Knight enemy nearby. They are a bit unassuming at first, especially just not even having a boss health bar when you get close to them, but they are essentially just as strong as any Crucible Knight proper boss from the base game, including having their own unique weapon and a moveset that is tied to it, which makes them a proper special enemy and unique fight in comparison to the more basic Crucible Knight enemies. On death, this one also drops not only its helmet, which boosts Crucible incantations just like the others, but also its weapon, Devonia's hammer, which is a pretty unique colossal hammer. 8th today then is going to be basically the start of a long chain. We're going into one of the more obscure areas of the expansion here, and along this path is a pair of mini-bosses that basically go together. One bonus mini-boss that is definitely its own thing, and then a full-on missable optional remembrance boss to cap it all off. That said, this path is in the Cathedral Depths area of the Shadow Keep, and specifically none of this stuff happens or can spawn until you have drained all of the water out of the area. To make it relatively simple then, I will show you how to do that and the full path to do so from the Storehouse back section Site of Grace. Once you have pulled the lever then, you can then jump down the exact place the lever is to reach the actual proper ground level of the area. There will be a Site of Grace right beside you, and once down here, the first of our mini-bosses is just a brief walk of a way forward, pretty much unmissable, and the other is just right around the side up the road from the first one, also in the outdoor area. Skip to the time on screen then for the next entry if you don't want to see them. Otherwise, these mini-bosses are both more ulcerated tree spirits. This time, somewhat drowned ones. Their fights aren't overly special, but the first one of these drops the Mantle of Thorns Faith sorcery, which stacks on top of roll damage armor to, well, make you do damage when you roll into things, which is just a really fun addition to any toolkit, honestly. And then if you just keep running around outside past this first enemy and down the street, you'll walk into the second ulcerated tree spirit, who on death will drop you an Iris of Occultation. These are somewhat rare items that are used in multiple different instances of the game of choice within the expansion. These are items that you need to make the choice that results in getting a weapon from it, so it's a very useful consumable to have multiple of for sure. 9th up then, also in this drained depths area behind the first part of our last entry, you'll have seen the entrance to what is essentially a church, the cathedral part of the Cathedral Depths. Walk right in and you'll have the next mini-boss encounter. Skip to the time on screen to avoid knowing what it actually is, but this is a unique version of the Fire Knight enemies, the Elder of the Fire Knights, and this one summons what are essentially undead made of flames to explode on top of you if they get anywhere close. He is easy enough if you bum rush him and just smack him around so he can't summon, but his entire goal is to overwhelm you with enemies and fire. This guy has some neat lore about him, which you can actually read from the drop that you get by killing him, which is the Death Mask Helmet, a Fire Knight variant helmet that reduces the FP cost of spirit summons by around 15%. An extremely niche effect, but a unique helmet nonetheless. 10th and finally then today, if you continue down the hallway from our last entry, you will find a closed door that leads to an elevator. The elevator goes down to a really ominous giant bridge that actually gives you no issues for crossing it, but then that leads to a church with a Site of Grace inside of it, and from the Site of Grace, you can quite clearly see that you are at the base of the Shadow Tree. To put it simply, when you walk out here, your presence will not be taken to kindly, so look away now if you don't actually want to know, but this is the tree of the Shadow Tree avatar, the twisted and crazy version of the Erdtree avatars from the first game, and this one is much more uniquely shaped with an incredibly special moveset, and it's honestly just an absolute gem of a special encounter, especially for an optional, missable remembrance boss. It isn't crazy hard as a fight, but there is a bit of a puzzle aspect to it, just engage your brain a little bit more, and overall it's just a really solid fight in my opinion. The reward that you get at the end of it then is actually sort of crazy. Of course you get the Remembrance, as this is a Remembrance boss, and this Remembrance can create a couple of really genuinely quite cool things, including one of the more fun weapons of the expansion in my opinion, and a really cool faith spell as well. But it also drops for you Miquella's Great Rune, which you can't use like the other Great Runes. It is instead just able to be used as a reusable consumable. I won't talk too much about what this is and what it can do, as it easily gets into later game spoilers, but just know that this has some really hefty implications to ponder. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A nice full collection of optional missable bosses, varying from being relatively mundane but in really odd and interesting places, or dropping really cool things, to just being really cool bosses themselves. Special and unique fights that are not necessarily crazy hard to find, but are very easy to just not realize they are what they are until you go over and you do them. I hope you've enjoyed this then, and hopefully I've been able to lead you to at least one new boss that you haven't found, and hopefully I've been able to lead at least a few people to the optional Remembrance boss they may not have found themselves. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.